Welcome to SnoozyTor, where the wild whispers you to sleep. Tonight we travel north, beyond roads, beyond maps, into the frozen silence of Alaska, a land where men vanish, and only wolves remember their names. This is the story of Elias Rowe, a man who walked into the wilderness and never came back. At least, not in the way we understand. He listened to wolves until he heard himself. He learned that silence can teach more than words ever could. And in that silence, he found something most of us have forgotten. So close your eyes. Feel the snow settling around you, the fire crackling low, and the breath of the wild brushing your skin. Because tonight, as the wolves sing beneath the Aurora, you'll hear what he heard. The sound that remains when everything else is gone. The first thing Elias Rowe felt was the silence. Not the gentle quiet of a sleeping city, but a silence that swallowed everything, sound, thought, even breath. It pressed against his ears as he stepped off the freight boat in Valdez, Alaska, in the winter of 1920. The wind came next, sharp and clean, sliding down from the glaciers and cutting through his wool coat as if the fabric were nothing. Behind him, the ship's whistle blew one last time and faded into the whiteness. Then it was gone. He stood there for a moment, boots sinking into frozen mud, staring at the mountains. They rose like frozen waves, blue at their bases, white at their peaks, older than memory. The air smelled of salt and pine and cold iron. Elias adjusted the straps of his pack and started walking inland, following no road, no map. He hadn't come north to find gold or glory. He'd come looking for something he couldn't name. Do you know that feeling? When the noise of life becomes so loud you'd give anything for silence. When every voice, every demand, every promise feels like static in your skull. That's what drove him here. Not adventure. Not escape. Just the hope of hearing nothing but his own heartbeat again. The first night he camped by a half-frozen creek. His fire crackled like nervous laughter in the stillness. The stars hung impossibly low, so close they seemed to tremble when he breathed. He ate a strip of dried venison and watched the steam from his breath twist upward until it vanished into the dark. In that moment he felt both enormous and small, like a single spark drifting through eternity. He remembered the trenches of France. The mud, the noise, the screams that never ended. Out here, the world was the opposite. Pure, unbroken, mercilessly calm. No one shouted orders. No one died screaming in the mud. If death came here, it would be silent, natural, without anger or chaos. He wondered if that made it better, or worse. Would you prefer a noisy death surrounded by others, or a quiet one under a sky like this? He didn't know the answer, but the question stayed with him, echoing in the frozen air. Days blurred together. The sun rose weakly and died by mid-afternoon. Frost gathered in his beard. His breath turned to crystals on his scarf. There were no tracks except his own. Even the ravens seemed to keep their distance, black silhouettes drifting high above him like omens that had grown tired of caring. Each step forward sank him deeper into the kind of solitude most people only imagine. He began to hear things, not voices exactly, but whispers in the snow. A shift of wind sounded like words he almost understood. Once he thought he heard someone calling his name across the tundra. But when he turned, there was only white emptiness stretching to the horizon. Have you ever been so alone that your own mind becomes company? So quiet that your thoughts begin to speak back to you? At night, the temperature dropped below 40 below zero. The cold became something alive, a creature crawling under his skin. He learned to keep moving, to never stop long enough for the stillness to take him. The land tested him, measured him, and found him small but persistent. After a week of walking, he reached a high ridge overlooking a valley glazed with ice. The northern lights began to move across the sky, slow ribbons of green and blue shimmering like breath on glass. He had heard of them before, but standing beneath them was something else entirely. They didn't look real. They looked like the pulse of the world made visible. He took off his gloves despite the cold and reached upward as if he could touch the light. For a heartbeat, he felt as though the universe was touching back. He whispered to no one, "This is what I came for." Do you think a place can recognize the person who belongs to it? That the land can sense when a lost soul has finally come home? The wind rose again, whistling through the pines like a song without words. Elias built his small fire, warmed his hands, and closed his eyes. The sound of burning wood was the only heartbeat in the world. Tomorrow he would go deeper, beyond the last signs of men, into the endless silence of the white north. He didn't know it yet, but the wolves were already watching him. When the sun returned, pale and distant, Elias met a man named Jonah. He was older, lean as driftwood, with eyes the color of river stones. He didn't say much, just nodded once and asked, "You heading inland?" Elias nodded. Jonah spat into the snow, then smiled. "Then you'll need to learn what silence means." They set out together toward the Chugach Range. The world around them was a vast canvas of white and gray, the sky heavy with slow-falling snow that erased every boundary. Jonah moved easily through it, like someone walking across a map he'd drawn himself. Elias followed, heavy and clumsy in comparison. "Don't look down," Jonah told him as they crossed the first frozen river. "Listen instead. The ice talks before it breaks." Elias listened. Beneath their boots, the ice groaned, a low, ancient voice warning them to move quickly. The sound carried through his bones. Have you ever felt the world speak to you? Not in words, but in vibrations you can feel beneath your skin? That's how the ice sounded. Alive, watchful, waiting. For 3 days they walked through valleys carved by wind and time. Their breath froze in the air and hung like ghosts behind them. At night, they slept under the open sky, wrapped in fur and silence. Jonah would point at stars and name them not as constellations, but as directions. "That one points to food," he said one night. "That one warns of storms." Elias asked him where he learned such things. Jonah smiled, showing teeth gone yellow from tobacco. "You don't learn. You listen. Everything that survives here is saying something. The trick is hearing it before it kills you. Do you think you could live in a place where listening means survival? Where a single mistake isn't just failure, it's death?" By the 4th day, the land rose sharply. The mountains loomed, dark blue against the horizon, their peaks hidden behind veils of snow. The wind changed, colder, faster, carrying the smell of pine sap and wolf fur. Elias could feel it tightening around him, as if the air itself wanted to test his resolve. Jonah stopped suddenly. He knelt, brushed away a thin layer of snow, and revealed a set of paw prints, large, deep, purposeful. "Wolves," he said. 2, maybe 3. Passing through last night. He touched one print with his bare fingers, almost gently. "They're hungry." Elias stared at the print, the shape of it so precise it seemed carved. For a moment, he imagined the animal's weight, its breath steaming under the moonlight. Something primal stirred inside him. Not fear exactly, but recognition. Have you ever seen something wild and felt it recognize you too? Like two creatures remembering they were once the same kind? That night, the wind rose until the tent ropes sang like strings. Snow blew sideways, fine as dust. The world disappeared into white. Jonah fed the fire with strips of birch bark and said, "The mountain doesn't care if you're ready. You climb or you die." Elias smiled weakly. "You make it sound simple." Jonah nodded. "It is simple. That's what makes it hard." The fire snapped. The smell of smoke and pine filled the tent. Elias lay awake, thinking about Jonah's words. In the war, simplicity had meant orders, survival, obedience. Out here, it meant something else entirely, something cleaner, more honest. He thought of his life before. Noise, rules, people pretending to know what mattered. Out here, there was no pretending. Hunger, cold, distance, those were truths no one could argue with. Do you ever wonder what would be left of you if every comfort vanished? If all that remained was your will to keep walking through the cold? When dawn came, the world was a blur of blue and white. They climbed through ice fields where the wind sculpted ridges into frozen waves. Elias fell more than once, cutting his hands on the sharp crust, but Jonah kept moving, never slowing, never looking back. Each time Elias stumbled, he heard Jonah's voice ahead. "Get up. The mountain's watching." By the time they reached the ridge, the sun was sinking. Below them stretched an endless plain of snow and shadow, the distant glimmer of frozen rivers winding like veins through the earth. For the first time since arriving in Alaska, Elias felt small enough to understand the truth of this place. It didn't belong to him. It never would. Jonah stood beside him, his breath steaming. "Out there," he said, nodding toward the horizon, "is where you find who you are, or lose it." Elias didn't answer. He just watched the light fade, the sky turning from blue to violet, the wind carrying whispers he couldn't quite decipher. Do you think a person has to be lost before they can be found? Out here, where silence is louder than thought, maybe that's the only way. The wind howled softly through the pass, sounding almost like laughter. Somewhere far below, a wolf answered. The storm began without warning. One moment the sky was clear, a pale sheet of silver stretched above the mountains. The next, it folded inward, heavy with snow. The air grew dense, charged. Even the ravens vanished, sensing what men could not. Elias and Jonah were halfway across a narrow valley when the wind struck. It came screaming down the slopes like a living thing, tearing snow from the ground and hurling it sideways. Within minutes, the world disappeared. The sky, the mountains, even Jonah's figure ahead, all swallowed by a swirling wall of white. Elias shouted, but the wind devoured his voice. He could barely see his own hands. The snow bit into his face like glass shards. He dropped to his knees, crawling toward the faint shape of Jonah's pack ahead. But then it was gone, erased as if the storm had decided to rewrite the world without him. Have you ever lost sight of someone and realized in that instant how fragile connection really is? How easily the thread between two souls can snap and vanish into nothing. Hours, or maybe days, passed in that blinding fury. Time meant nothing. The only measure was breath and pain. Elias wrapped his scarf over his face, leaned into the wind and walked. Sometimes he thought he saw Jonah's shadow flickering through the storm ahead. Sometimes he thought he heard his name whispered by the snow. He followed both illusions because to stop would mean dying. At some point the wind shifted. The snow fell softer, heavier. Elias collapsed behind a rock outcrop, dug into the drift like an animal burrowing for warmth. His fingers were numb, his boots stiff with ice. He couldn't feel his legs. He ate the last of his jerky, though it was hard as bone. He tried to remember Jonah's last words. "Listen to the silence," Jonah had said once. "It'll tell you what you need to know." But all Elias heard now was the sound of his own heartbeat, slow and stubborn. Have you ever been so alone that even your pulse becomes company? So cold that your body feels like it belongs to the snow, not to you? The next morning, if it was morning, the storm had passed. The valley lay quiet, blanketed in fresh snow, untouched. Elias stood slowly, joints aching, and scanned the white horizon. No tracks, no tent, no Jonah. Only stillness. He called the man's name once, then again. The sound carried strangely in the air, flat and empty. No echo. Somewhere beneath that snow, maybe a mile away, maybe 10, lay the man who had led him through the mountains. Elias lowered his head. The silence around him wasn't cruel, it was absolute, beyond grief or mercy. He built a small fire that evening beneath a cluster of black pines. The flames flickered weakly in the wind. He melted snow for water, tasted metal and pine sap. Hunger gnawed at his belly, deep and slow, like the pull of gravity. He thought of turning back but didn't. There was nowhere to return to. Civilization was a dream that had already faded. What would you do if the world erased every direction except forward? Would you walk on even if you didn't know what waited ahead? That night, the temperature plunged. He woke every hour to feed the fire, terrified it would die. In the darkness, he thought he saw movement beyond the trees, a pair of eyes, yellow and distant, watching. Wolf or ghost, he couldn't tell. He only knew he wasn't entirely alone anymore. He whispered into the dark, "If you're there, I mean no harm." The eyes blinked once and vanished. By the third day, his food was gone. His mind drifted in and out of strange clarity. He spoke to the wind, to Jonah, to himself. Sometimes he heard answers that weren't real. He stumbled upon a frozen stream and followed it downhill. The ice groaned beneath his boots. He caught sight of fish suspended in the water, perfectly still. Life paused between moments. He envied them. When he finally found shelter, a shallow cave at the base of a ridge, he fell inside and laughed, a dry sound that cracked the air. He wasn't sure if it was relief or madness. He made a small fire from broken branches and watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling. Do you think a man has to break before he understands what holds him together? Maybe that's what survival really is, not strength but surrender. Elias slept, dreaming of Jonah's voice carried on the wind, whispering, "Keep walking." When he woke, the storm had cleared completely. The stars shone sharp and infinite above the ridge. The cold had taken everything but left him breathing. And in that moment, wrapped in fur and silence, Elias Rowe realized something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. You don't conquer the wild. You endure it. And if you're lucky, it allows you to stay. When the storm finally broke, the world was silent again. The kind of silence that feels like the world is holding its breath. Elias stepped out from the cave, stiff and hollow, and saw sunlight glittering across a valley untouched by tracks. Every sound, every scent seemed new, as if the land itself had been remade overnight. He walked for 2 days through that quiet, guided only by instinct and the faint pull of smoke in the distance. At first he thought he imagined it, a trick of light or hunger, but the third morning he found it. A cabin. It sat at the edge of a frozen lake, its roof sagging beneath snow, chimney leaning like a tired shoulder. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges. He hesitated, listening. No birds, no movement. Only the soft creak of ice shifting beneath his boots. Inside it smelled of pine, ash, and something older. A fire pit blackened with soot. Shelves carved by hand. And in one corner, bones. Human by the shape of them. A skull rested near a pile of tools, empty sockets turned toward the window as if still watching the lake. Elias didn't recoil. He only stood there for a while, studying the remains. There was no fear, only a strange kinship. Whoever this was, they had once stood where he stood now, cold, hungry, alone, fighting the same endless winter. Have you ever felt close to someone you've never met? As if time itself bent for a moment, letting two lives touch? He gathered the bones carefully and buried them in the frozen earth beside the cabin. The ground was hard, but he worked until his hands bled. When the last bit of soil was pressed down, he whispered, "Rest easy. I'll keep the fire burning." Then he repaired the door, patched the roof with bark and hide, and built his first true fire since Jonah vanished. The warmth filled the space slowly, breathing life into the old walls. He sat near it, thawing fingers that no longer felt like his own. For the first time in weeks, he let his body loosen. When the fire cracked, he thought of Jonah again, the way the man had listened to the snow. Elias wondered if this cabin, this place, had once been Jonah's too. But he didn't chase the thought. The mind can trick you when it's lonely, turning coincidence into ghosts. Do you ever wonder how thin the line is between memory and imagination? Between the living and the echoes they leave behind? He found tools, traps, a knife so dull it could barely cut bark. He spent the next days rebuilding, shaping the place into a home. Each motion, splitting wood, boiling water, setting snares, became ritual. The world outside was still vast and indifferent, but inside these small wooden walls, Elias began to feel something he hadn't in months: belonging. At night, he wrote in the margins of an old ledger he found, "The dead man built this shelter to survive the cold. Now I rebuild it to survive the silence." He would wake before dawn, melt snow for tea, and watch the slow light crawl across the floorboards. He began to count time not by days, but by how long the fire lasted before dying down. There was a rhythm to it, a conversation between wood and flame. Do you think peace is something we find, or something we build piece by piece? Out here, Elias thought peace wasn't comfort. It was simply the absence of fear. Weeks passed. The lake thawed and refroze. Sometimes at night, he'd hear the wind whisper through the cracks and imagine the voice of the man whose bones now slept outside. Not haunting him, just keeping him company. He'd whisper back softly, "I'm still here." And maybe that was enough, for both of them. By the time the next storm came, Elias was ready. The fire blazed, the walls held, and for the first time since stepping into the wild, he didn't feel like an intruder. He had become part of the rhythm, part of the silence. Have you ever stayed somewhere long enough that it began to accept you? That the walls, the air, even the night itself started to know your name? That winter, the man who had come to Alaska searching for quiet finally found it. Not as emptiness, but as presence. A kind of stillness that hummed with life, ancient and vast. And somewhere, far beyond the cabin, in the frozen woods where the wolves ran, something unseen paused and listened back. Morning came softly, with pale light sliding through cracks in the cabin walls. Elias stirred, listening. Not to the fire or the creak of wood, but to the hush beyond, the breath of the land itself. Out here, silence wasn't empty. It was layered. Every still moment held 1,000 small sounds. The sigh of snow settling, the faint moan of ice beneath the lake, the whisper of wind brushing against pine needles. He began to rise with the dawn, not because he wanted to, but because the world demanded it. The cold made sleep light, fleeting. His first act each morning was to feed the fire, 1 ember, 2 twigs, 3 breaths, and then water for tea. Every motion had meaning. There was no waste. Do you notice how, when life becomes simple, even the smallest act feels sacred? Lighting a fire, boiling water, breathing. Elias had started to keep time not by days or dates, but by tasks. Set traps at first light. Gather branches before dusk. patched the roof when the wind grew restless. He realized that survival wasn't chaos, it was rhythm. The same rhythm wolves followed when they hunted, or rivers followed when they froze and thawed. Life in the wild wasn't cruel, it was precise. When hunger came, he no longer panicked. He read the land the way others read a map. Rabbit trails crisscrossing the snow. The sudden silence of birds that meant a fox nearby. The faint scent of resin that meant a storm 2 days away. He learned by watching, by listening, by being quiet enough for the forest to teach him. Have you ever stopped long enough to feel the world teaching you, without words, without rules? What do you think you might learn if you simply listened? Sometimes, as he checked his traps, Elias would pause to watch the sun drift low across the mountains. Its light turned the snow into a sea of molten silver. He'd stand there, still as the trees, and feel something move through him, gratitude perhaps, or something older than that. A belonging that didn't need proof. At night, he would sit by the fire and write in the dead man's ledger. The forest speaks in pattern. The trick is not to interrupt. He began to see the same patterns in himself. The way his breath matched the flicker of the flames. The way hunger and satisfaction traded places like tides. The way fear came and went, no longer sharp but soft, like the curve of wind over snow. Once, he caught his reflection in the ice at the edge of the lake and didn't recognize it. His beard was wild, his eyes brighter. He laughed quietly and said aloud, "So this is what happens when the noise is gone. Do you think silence changes a person, or just reveals who they were all along?" As weeks passed, the line between Elias and the wilderness blurred. He stopped talking to himself because the land answered in its own way. The groan of trees became a kind of language, the flight of ravens a warning. Even the wolves' distant howls felt like conversation. He didn't see them yet, but he felt their presence, always on the edge of sound, always just beyond sight. They weren't enemies. They were neighbors, perhaps even teachers. He imagined them moving through the snow with purpose, never wasting motion, never doubting what they were. He envied that certainty. One night, as the fire burned low, he wrote, "Humans build walls to keep the dark out, but maybe the dark was never the enemy." He closed the ledger and leaned back, listening to the soft hum of the world outside. The stars flickered faintly through the window gap. For the first time in years, his mind felt still. No regrets, no ambitions, just presence. Have you ever felt a moment so complete that it didn't need anything added? No joy, no sorrow, just existence in its purest form? That night, Elias slept deeply. No dreams, no memories, just the steady rhythm of the wind moving through the trees, the same rhythm that had always been there, waiting for someone quiet enough to hear it. The first time Elias saw them, he almost thought he was dreaming. It was late afternoon, the sky the color of tarnished silver, the air still enough to hear snowflakes land. He had been tracking moose sign along the ridge when the forest went suddenly quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just the heartbeat of the land holding still. And then he saw them. 5 wolves moving single file across the valley below. Gray and white shapes gliding through the snow, silent as ghosts. Their rhythm was perfect, heads low, paws falling into one another's prints as if choreographed by something older than time. Elias crouched behind a drift and watched. His breath made small clouds that vanished in the still air. The wolves didn't hurry, didn't stalk, didn't even look around. They just moved, steady, deliberate, efficient. Have you ever watched something so wild, so free that it made your own life feel smaller, and somehow more precious at the same time? He followed them from a distance, careful not to break the snow crust or let his scent carry. Every few minutes, one of them would glance back, scanning the trees, ears twitching. The leader, a black wolf with a scar across its muzzle, moved like it owned the land. Not arrogance, just certainty. Elias admired that. The wolves knew exactly who they were. Humans, he thought, spent lifetimes trying to remember. As the light faded, the wolves stopped near the edge of a frozen river. Elias crouched behind a fallen spruce and watched. They were hunting. A small herd of caribou grazed in the open expanse beyond the river, unaware of the danger. The wolves spread out, 2 circling wide, 2 holding back. The scarred one waited. No growling, no noise, just patience. And when the lead caribou lifted its head, sensing something, the wolves moved, not in chaos but in harmony. A blur of motion across the white. Snow flying. The herd bolted. The wolves followed, but only after the weakest. Within seconds, it was over. The pack stood over the fallen animal, breathing hard, steam rising around them like mist. Elias didn't look away. He couldn't. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't kind. It was life stripped of illusion. Do you think balance requires beauty, or does it live in the brutal moments too? He watched as the wolves ate, not greedily but in order. The alpha first, then the others, one by one, each waiting their turn. He noticed how they left nothing behind, not bone, not fur, not waste. Every part had purpose. Every act served the whole. When they finished, the scarred wolf looked up toward the ridge. Elias froze. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, man and wolf. No fear, no challenge, just understanding. The wolf turned away, led the pack into the trees, and vanished into the dusk. Elias stood there long after they were gone. He felt no urge to follow, no desire to claim or conquer. Just awe. A recognition that what he had witnessed wasn't a scene of violence. It was communion. A glimpse into a world that existed perfectly without human interference. That night, by the fire, he wrote in the ledger, "Wolves do not take more than they need. They do not lie. They do not waste. They are the truest mirrors we have." He stared at the words until the ink blurred. The wind outside carried a faint, distant howl. It was low, mournful, endless, a sound both lonely and complete. Have you ever heard something so wild that it felt like it came from inside you rather than outside? He closed his eyes and listened. In that sound he heard everything: hunger, loyalty, sorrow, purpose. He realized that maybe the wolves weren't symbols or monsters. They were simply living as the world intended. And perhaps in his own quiet way so was he. The next morning, Elias found their tracks outside the cabin. The paw prints led to the lake's edge, then disappeared across the ice. He smiled, touched one print gently, and whispered, "Thank you." Because in their movement, their clarity, he had seen the thing he'd been searching for all along. Not freedom from the world, but a place within it. The snow returned quietly that week, soft, fine, and endless. It fell like time itself, slow and unbothered, blurring the edges of the world. Elias moved through it in silence, his breath fogging in the pale air, the sound of his steps muffled under the weight of fresh drifts. He had grown accustomed to the rhythm now. Light the fire, check the traps, read the sky, listen. Always listen. Because out here, silence wasn't absence, it was language. One morning, as he knelt to reset a snare by the edge of the lake, he noticed something new. Tracks. Not human. Not caribou. 4 distinct prints in a straight line, deliberate and clear. He followed them for a short distance, heart steady but alert. They circled his cabin once, then continued toward the woods. No sign of threat, just presence. He smiled. "They've accepted me," he whispered. But even as he said it, he knew acceptance in the wild was never ownership. It was permission, temporary, conditional, sacred. Have you ever felt seen by something that owed you nothing? Not judged, not welcomed, just seen? That night he heard them again. Closer this time. The low, harmonic rise of a howl echoed across the valley. One voice, then another, then 5, layering, weaving, folding into each other until it felt less like sound and more like breath. The cabin walls vibrated with it. Elias stepped outside. The air was still. Moonlight poured over the frozen lake, turning it to glass. On the far ridge, dark shapes moved, shadows against shadows. The wolves, they didn't come closer, didn't flee. They simply existed there, aware of him as he was of them. He felt no fear, only quiet recognition. For a long time he stood under that sky, breathing the same cold air they did. Something inside him loosened, the last knot of the old world. Fear, doubt, noise. He exhaled and let it drift away like mist. Do you think silence can be a kind of trust? The way 2 beings can share space without trying to fill it with words? In the days that followed, the wolf's presence became constant but never intrusive. He'd find new tracks near the frozen stream. Sometimes bones left beside his snares, clean as if offered. Once, he found his trap untouched, but the bait gone, the snow around it disturbed just enough to leave the impression of a paw print beside his own. He took it as a message: "We see you. We understand." He began to speak less, even to himself. His thoughts grew quieter, matching the pace of the landscape. He realized that solitude wasn't the absence of company, it was the presence of everything else. At night, he'd sit by the fire and watch the flames flicker against the window frost. He could almost imagine the wolves beyond watching the same light from their side of the dark. He wondered if they saw him as a rival or a ghost or something in between. Perhaps they didn't think of him at all. And maybe that was peace. Have you ever noticed that real connection doesn't always announce itself? Sometimes it's just knowing you're not alone, even when no one speaks your name. As the weeks passed, Elias began to move differently, slower, more deliberate, as if his body had learned the wolves' rhythm. He stepped where they would have stepped. He slept when the valley slept. The boundary between man and wilderness thinned. He wasn't pretending to be them. He was simply learning how to exist without disturbing the balance. One morning he found the black wolf's tracks near the tree line. They stopped halfway down a slope, where the wolf had stood and watched the valley. Elias placed his hand in the print. The snow was fresh, the edges sharp. He smiled softly. No words were needed. That was the pact. The silence, the shared understanding that in this frozen corner of the world both of them belonged. He walked back to the cabin under a pale rising sun. The fire still burned inside, waiting for him. He added another log, warmed his hands, and whispered, "Thank you for letting me stay." Outside, far in the distance, a single howl answered. Oh, measured, almost gentle. And for the first time, Elias didn't just hear it, he understood it. It happened in the quietest way, as such moments often do. There was no wind that morning, no sign that the day would be different. The sky was a pale wash of blue over endless white, the kind of stillness that makes sound seem almost impolite. Elias stepped out of the cabin with a small bundle of dried meat, his boots creaking against the frost. The snow glittered like powdered glass. He was halfway to the tree line when he felt it, a presence. Not danger, not fear, just awareness. He stopped. And there, 30 paces ahead, stood the black wolf. It was larger than he'd imagined, muscles moving beneath its fur with the slow precision of something that had never known doubt. Its coat caught the light, silver on black, shimmering with frost. They faced each other in silence. Have you ever felt time pause, not stop, but hold its breath, as if the world itself were watching to see what you do next? Elias didn't move. Neither did the wolf. The air between them vibrated with quiet understanding. He slowly crouched, laid the bundle of meat on the snow, and stepped back. The wolf's yellow eyes followed him, unblinking. Then, with a grace that belonged entirely to the wild, it approached. Every step was deliberate, every breath visible. When it reached the offering, it didn't lunge or snarl. It simply lowered its head and took one piece. Then it looked up again. In that gaze, Elias saw no submission, no gratitude, only recognition. Two beings acknowledging each other's right to exist. Do you think respect needs words? Or can it live in silence, carried only by the space between breaths? The wolf finished, then turned toward the forest. But before it vanished into the trees, it paused and looked back. Not curiosity, not farewell. Something older. Something that said, "I see you." Elias stood rooted long after the tracks had faded. He felt his pulse slow, steady, synchronized with something vast and ancient. He realized he wasn't alone and hadn't been for a long time. The wilderness had been watching him, weighing him, and, at last, had decided he could stay. That night the air was still. The sky burned with cold stars. Elias sat by the fire and tried to capture what he'd felt in words, but the pen trembled and language failed. He wrote only one line in the ledger. The wild does not speak in words. It speaks in recognition. He stared at it until the ink dried, then closed the book. Outside, faint howls rippled through the dark, long, low, harmonic. He didn't hear them as warning or mourning anymore. They sounded like a song, one he almost remembered from some distant part of himself. Have you ever listened to something and felt deep down that it was meant for you, even if you couldn't explain why? He stepped outside. The cold hit him like a truth too pure to resist. The wolves were somewhere beyond the ridge, unseen, but he felt them as surely as heartbeat. He raised his face to the stars and exhaled a slow, steady breath into the frozen night. It rose and drifted upward, vanishing into starlight. In that moment he didn't feel human or wild, just alive. No separation, no hierarchy, only balance. Later, back inside, the fire cracked softly. The walls creaked as the night deepened. Elias closed his eyes and thought, not in words but in sensations. The scent of pine, the weight of snow, the gaze of the wolf. He realized that communion wasn't something you found. It was something that found you, once you've grown quiet enough to listen. Have you ever wondered if the universe has been waiting for you to stop speaking so it can finally answer? Elias smiled faintly in the dark. The wolves howled once more, and this time his heartbeat joined the rhythm. Days began to blur, not in confusion but in harmony. Each sunrise folded gently into the next. Each night carried the same slow rhythm of the fire breathing and the wolves calling from beyond the ridge. Elias no longer counted the days. The world itself had become his clock. The shift of light, the temperature of the air, the way ravens called when snow was coming. He started noticing small things. How the frost grew in patterns along the cabin window, never random, always with symmetry, like the handwriting of cold itself. How the wind would change pitch depending on where the moon sat. How the wolves howled differently depending on the stars above. He began to wonder if nature wasn't silent at all, if it was speaking constantly only in a language most humans had forgotten to hear. Have you ever realized that maybe the world has been speaking to you all along, but too quietly for the noise in your mind to let it through? Each morning, Elias stepped outside before dawn. The snow beneath his boots sang faintly, a crisp, hollow sound that told him how cold the night had been. He'd tilt his head back and study the sky. There were tracks there too, just not the kind that left prints. The Aurora shimmered faintly, green ribbons shifting above the mountains. He thought of them as trails, as if the spirits of migrating creatures moved across the heavens, leaving light instead of footprints. He didn't pray. He didn't ask. He just watched. That, he realized, was enough. Do you think stillness can be its own kind of prayer? One made not with words, but with attention? The ledger on his table began to fill again. Not with survival notes, but with observations written like poetry. Wind from the east, soft, forgiving. Snow whispers in circles today. The wolves are restless. The stars lean closer. His handwriting had changed too, smaller, slower, as if trying to match the patience of the land. Sometimes he would follow the wolves' tracks through the snow until they disappeared at the horizon, then turn back. He didn't need to find them. It was enough to know they were near. Their existence reminded him that life didn't need witnesses to be real. Once, while crossing the frozen lake, he heard a sound deep below, the low groan of shifting ice. It echoed like a heartbeat from the earth's core. He stopped, closed his eyes, and listened. It felt alive. Have you ever heard something so vast that it made your own heartbeat seem like an echo? He knelt down, pressed a gloved hand to the ice, and whispered, "I hear you." And for a fleeting second he thought the sound changed, as if answering. That night, as the sky bloomed with light, Elias wrote, "The world is not mute. It waits. It waits for us to remember how to listen." He sat by the fire afterward, tracing the patterns of smoke. They curled upward, slow and deliberate, merging with the aurora shimmering through the cabin's gaps. He felt a strange certainty then, that the boundary between heaven and earth, between silence and song, wasn't as fixed as he'd once believed. He wondered if the wolves saw the same sky and understood it the same way. Maybe they followed constellations the way he followed rivers. Maybe their howls were replies to messages written in starlight. Do you ever look up at the night sky and feel as if someone, or something, is looking back? As he drifted toward sleep, the wind shifted. A faint hum moved through the trees, like a whisper too old to translate. Elias smiled in the dark. He didn't need to know what it meant. He only needed to know that it was real. And that, in this quiet northern wilderness, every breath, every gust, every flicker of light was part of one long conversation. A story that had begun long before him and would continue long after. The nights had grown longer again. The kind of dark that swallowed even the thought of dawn. Elias had stopped fearing it. Darkness was no longer an enemy, it was a blanket, vast and patient. It folded over the cabin each evening, muffling the crackle of the fire and slowing the beat of his heart until both seemed to pulse in time with the wilderness outside. But that night something changed. He woke to a sound. Soft, measured, footsteps. At first he thought it was the wind dragging branches across the roof. But the rhythm was too steady. Crunch, pause, crunch. Snow compressing under deliberate weight. He held his breath and listened. The sound circled the cabin once, slow and calm, then stopped. Have you ever been so still that your heartbeat feels louder than the world? He waited. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The sound didn't return. Only the faint hum of the wind against the door frame and the distant groan of ice on the lake. Finally he rose, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside. The night was clear. The moon hung low, bright enough to turn the snow into a field of mirrors. Elias scanned the edge of the trees. Nothing. But near the fire pit he saw them, prints. Wolf prints. Large, distinct, fresh. He crouched, tracing the shape with a gloved hand. The edges were crisp, undisturbed by drifting snow. Whoever had come had left only minutes ago. He should have been cautious. Instead, he felt something else, something close to wonder. Do you think fear and awe might be the same feeling, just seen from different sides? He followed the prints a short distance, stopping at the tree line. Beyond that, the forest waited, dark, silent, infinite. He could sense eyes watching, though not in menace. More like curiosity. He whispered, "It's all right. I'm still here." The wind carried his words away. For a while he stood there, breathing clouds into the cold, listening for movement. But only silence answered. He turned back toward the cabin, each step leaving its own trail beside the wolves. Two paths side by side, crossing briefly before parting again. That night he couldn't sleep. Every sound felt closer, the creak of the wood, the faint sigh of snow against the door, the distant crack of ice splitting on the lake. It wasn't loneliness, it was recognition. The world was no longer empty, it was full, alive, listening back. He wrote in the ledger, "Sometimes I think the wild remembers us long before we remember it. Have you ever wondered if the places you love remember you too? The sound of your steps, the warmth of your fire, the weight of your breathing?" In the days that followed, the footsteps returned. Always at night. Always circling once, never closer. A ritual, perhaps. A greeting. He began to wait for it, lying awake by the fire, listening for that soft rhythm in the snow. It came without fail, steady, unhurried, like a heartbeat just outside the walls. He stopped feeling the need to look anymore. It wasn't about seeing. It was about trust. And slowly, he began to hear other sounds too. The deep shifting of the frozen lake, the distant bark of a fox, the flutter of wings overhead. Together, they made a kind of music, subtle and continuous. He realized something simple yet profound. The wilderness had never been silent. He had been too loud to hear it. Do you think silence is something we find, or something we uncover when the noise finally fades? As he drifted towards sleep, the footsteps came one last time that winter. They circled the cabin, paused by the door, then faded toward the woods. Elias smiled without opening his eyes. He didn't need to see to know. The wolves were near, and the echoes in the snow weren't haunting him. They were reminding him that he belonged. Winter settled in like an old truth, slow, certain, absolute. The kind of cold that doesn't just touch the skin but seeps inward, testing what you're made of. The kind of silence that holds no mercy, yet no malice either. Elias had stopped marking time. The calendar had no meaning here. What mattered were the small things, the color of the smoke, the thickness of the frost, the weight of the air before a storm. He no longer asked when spring would come. He only asked if the fire had enough wood to make it through the night. The wolves had gone quiet. Their howls, once nightly, became rare, distant. He imagined them deeper in the mountains, following caribou, keeping to their rhythm. He envied them, their certainty, their belonging. Have you ever wanted to belong so completely that you disappear into what you love? The days passed in quiet labor. He repaired the roof again, stitched his gloves, checked his traps. The cold was relentless. Every breath stung, every movement demanded purpose. There was no room for waste, not of time, not of energy, not of thought. At night, the fire burned low and the cabin filled with soft shadows. Sometimes Elias would speak aloud, not to anyone but to the space around him. "Still here," he'd say. The words hung in the air for a moment before the cold swallowed them whole. One evening, after a long stretch of snow, he found himself standing by the frozen lake. The sky above was perfectly clear. The stars were so sharp they looked carved. He could see his breath rising in slow spirals, fading into the endless dark. And for the first time, he didn't feel small. He felt right-sized. Do you think the world is trying to humble us, or remind us of where we truly fit? He watched the stars until his eyes watered from the cold. He realized that everything he had feared about solitude was wrong. It wasn't emptiness. It was clarity. Loneliness had teeth only when you resisted it. But if you accepted it, welcomed it, it turned into something else. Presence. He wrote in the ledger. There is a difference between being alone and being abandoned. The world leaves no one. It simply waits for us to listen. He closed the book and let the silence deepen. Outside, snowflakes fell in slow, deliberate spirals. Each one unique, each one dissolving without regret. He thought about the people he'd known, the voices that had filled his life before the wilderness. He missed them, but not with pain. He missed them the way you miss sunlight on a cloudy day, knowing it's still there, just hidden for now. Have you ever realized that missing someone can be a kind of gratitude? A sign that what you shared was real enough to echo beyond its time? That night, Elias dreamed of walking through the forest under a sky that glowed like liquid silver. The wolves were beside him, neither leading nor following. They moved together, silent, certain, at peace. When he woke, the dream clung to him like warmth. He stepped outside and found the air perfectly still, not even a whisper of wind. It was the kind of stillness that felt like being seen. He smiled softly and whispered, "I understand now." Not what the wilderness was or what it meant, but that understanding itself wasn't the goal. The goal was to be, fully, quietly, here. Have you ever felt that moment, when questions stop mattering and just breathing feels like enough? The wolves howled again that night, far away but clear. Their voices rolled through the valley, through the trees, through him. He sat by the fire and listened, eyes closed, heart steady. It wasn't a call. It wasn't a warning. It was a reminder that he was part of something vast and alive, and that in knowing so little, he had finally begun to know enough. The thaw began quietly. No grand moment, no sudden flood, just a subtle change in the light. Snow softened at the edges, the air grew damp, and the wind carried the faint scent of pine and earth again. The wilderness was exhaling as if after a long, deep sleep. Elias noticed it first in the sound. The steady groan of ice on the lake turned to a trickle. Water, free again, murmured beneath the surface. It was the first true voice of spring. He stepped outside, letting the pale sunlight wash over his face. It was weak and watery, but it felt like grace. Every winter feels eternal until it ends. Every silence feels endless until something begins to sing again. Have you ever noticed how renewal never announces itself? It just begins quietly, like breath returning? For weeks, the forest had been still. Now it stirred. Birds returned, tentative at first, their calls scattered like half-remembered words. The trees dripped slowly, snow melting from their shoulders. Elias found himself smiling without realizing it. The world was waking and so was he. And then one morning he heard them. The wolves. At first only one voice, a low, familiar howl from beyond the ridge. Then another. And another. The sound rolled through the valley like the breaking of dawn. Elias froze, every sense alive. He had waited for that sound all winter, and now it filled the air like a promise kept. He followed the echoes toward the trees, careful, slow. When he reached the clearing beyond the frozen stream, he saw them. The pack. 5 wolves again, though smaller now, lean from the long cold. The black alpha stood apart, its coat glistening under the thawing light. And behind them, 2 smaller shapes, uncertain on their legs, tumbling in the snow. Pups. For a long while, Elias just watched. The adults moved around the little ones in slow circles, protective but calm. No chaos, no noise. Just structure, rhythm, care. He felt something bloom inside him, something he hadn't known he was still capable of. Joy. Not the loud kind, but the quiet joy that lives in the bones, the kind that doesn't need words. Do you think hope always comes this way, softly, without asking to be noticed? The wolves didn't look at him this time. They didn't need to. His presence no longer disturbed them. He was part of the landscape now, no threat, no stranger. Just another living thing in the long rhythm of survival. He stood there for hours until the pups grew tired and the pack moved back into the trees. When they vanished, the clearing felt lighter, not emptier. The silence they left behind was full of meaning. That evening, Elias sat by the lake watching the last sheets of ice break and drift. The air smelled of wet soil and thawing moss. He thought about how everything had a cycle: birth, hunger, cold, renewal. Even loneliness. He wrote in the ledger. The wolves returned with their young today. They do not celebrate life. They live it. He stared at the page for a long moment before closing the book. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a pup yipped, high, eager, alive. He smiled again, eyes closed. Have you ever realized that the world keeps beginning, even when you think it's ending? That night, he dreamed of running with them, not as man or beast, but as something in between, something that belonged wholly to the rhythm of the wild. When he woke, Dawn was breaking, pink and gold across the horizon. He stepped outside barefoot, feeling the thawed ground beneath him. The world had moved on without asking his permission, and he was grateful. The wolves were gone for now, but their tracks led away from the cabin, curling toward the mountains like a story still being written. Elias traced one with his hand and whispered, "Go well." He understood now that the wilderness didn't offer endings, only continuations, only the promise that life, fragile, fierce, unending, would keep finding its way forward. Time began to lose its edges. Days didn't pass, they drifted. Seasons didn't change, they breathed. Elias no longer counted the months or measured the sun. Life had become circular, like the path of the wolves through the valley, like the slow return of spring to snow. He had built a rhythm around small things. Mend the roof when the rain began to whisper. Gather berries when the wind softened. Listen for the wolves when the moon grew full. It was enough. Have you ever lived a day so quiet that you could hear your own heartbeat echo inside the world's rhythm? The years the villagers called the hungry years, Elias came to know as the quiet years. There were no visitors, no letters, no proof that the world beyond the ridges still existed. And yet he was never truly alone. The wolves came and went. Sometimes he saw them from afar, a flash of silver fur near the lake, a chorus of howls at dusk. They didn't linger, but their presence lingered in him. He'd begun to understand their pattern. When they hunted, when they slept, when they vanished into the mountains. There was a logic to it, a kind of music, and he found himself living to that same tune. At dawn, he would step outside with tea steaming in his hands. The air smelled of pine sap and thawed soil. He'd close his eyes and listen. The forest breathed around him, alive, complete. He realized something simple yet profound. Peace wasn't found by escaping life's noise. It was found by learning to hear the silence beneath it. Do you think peace is something we search for, or something that's been waiting for us all along inside the quiet? When storms came, Elias no longer feared them. He welcomed the wind as an old friend, the snow as a reminder of what endurance feels like. He'd sit by the fire and listen to the world test the walls of his cabin, smiling faintly as if the earth itself were knocking just to make sure he was still there. He wrote less in the ledger now. The pages had filled with enough. Sometimes instead he'd carve lines into birch bark, brief thoughts, fragments, half-prayers. Stillness doesn't mean nothing moves. Even quiet has a pulse. He began to notice that the forest changed its tone depending on his state of mind. When he was restless, the wind felt sharp. When he was calm, it hummed softly through the trees. Perhaps, he thought, the wilderness was not outside him anymore. Perhaps it was speaking through him. Have you ever felt that the place you live in has begun to live in you too? Seasons cycled. The wolves' pups grew into hunters. Elias's beard turned white, his steps slower. But his spirit felt lighter. The ache of solitude had faded into something gentler, companionship with the world itself. One evening, while repairing a snare by the stream, he saw the black alpha again. Older now, scars softened by time. The wolf stood on the opposite bank, watching him. Neither moved. Then the wolf dipped its head just once before fading back into the trees. Elias felt tears prick his eyes, though he didn't know why. It wasn't sadness. It was the quiet beauty of recognition. He whispered, "We both learned how to stay." That night, as the Aurora swept across the sky like a slow river of light, he sat outside until dawn. The air shimmered with frost. He thought of all the things he no longer needed: noise, names, proof, tomorrow. Have you ever reached a point where you realize there's nothing left to seek, only to live? When morning came, the world looked unchanged. But Elias knew that something had shifted forever. He was no longer surviving the wilderness. He was part of it, woven into its pulse, its seasons, its memory. And in that belonging, there was no fear of time, no dread of endings. Only continuity. The quiet years were not about silence. They were about harmony. The morning began like any other. Thin light spilled through the cracks of the cabin, dust drifting in the beam. Elias stirred, stretched, and listened. The forest was calm. The wolves had moved higher into the hills. The lake had refrozen overnight, its surface smooth as glass. He brewed tea over the embers, the soft hiss of steam filling the room. That was when he heard it. A sound he hadn't heard in years. Footsteps, 2 not 4. Human. Slow. Hesitant. Crunching snow, drawing closer. Elias froze, cup in hand. For a moment he thought it might be memory playing tricks again, the mind's way of testing how long solitude could stretch before breaking. But then came the voice. Hello. It was faint, cracked with cold, uncertain whether anyone would answer. Elias set down his cup, rose and opened the door. A young man stood there, wrapped in a torn parka, cheeks raw from wind. His eyes widened at the sight of Elias, as if he'd stumbled into a myth instead of a man. The stranger stammered. I saw smoke. Didn't think anyone lived out here. Elias nodded slowly. Not many do. The boy hesitated. May I come in? Elias stepped aside. The visitor entered, shoulders tense, scanning the cabin like someone who'd forgotten what safety looked like. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire filled the silence. Finally, Elias poured him tea. The boy drank greedily, hands trembling. You've been out here long? The boy asked. Long enough to stop counting, Elias replied. Have you ever met someone who feels like a reflection of your past? A version of you you'd almost forgotten? The young man, his name was Aaron, was part of a survey crew that had gotten separated during a storm. He'd wandered for days before spotting Elias's chimney smoke. He spoke quickly, nervously, as if words were armor. Elias listened more than he answered. The boy's energy felt foreign now, restless, full of purpose and fear in equal measure. He talked of towns and machines, of maps and deadlines, of how wild the land still was. Elias smiled faintly. It's only wild if you fight it. Aaron frowned. You mean, you don't want to leave? Elias looked toward the window where frost bloomed softly on the glass. I already left, he said quietly. A long time ago. The boy didn't understand. How could he? Understanding comes from stillness, and Aaron had not yet learned how to be still. Have you ever noticed how people talk to fill the silence, afraid of what they might hear if it answered back? They shared a meal that evening, simple broth, dried herbs, and silence. Aaron glanced at the shelves, at the old ledger with its fading ink. You've written a lot, he said. About what? Listening, Elias answered. Later, when the fire burned low, Aaron asked, Aren't you lonely out here? Elias stirred the embers gently. Sparks rose like fireflies. Not anymore, he said. Loneliness is wanting something you don't have. Peace is wanting nothing. The boy fell silent after that. Outside, the wolves began to howl, one long note rising and falling like breath. Aaron flinched. Elias smiled. They're not calling for us, he said. They're calling to each other. Have you ever realized that not every sound in this world is meant for you, and yet, somehow, it still includes you? By morning, the storm had cleared. Elias gave the boy food, directions, and his only compass. Aaron hesitated at the door. Will I ever see you again? Elias shook his head. You don't need to. The boy nodded, then turned and walked into the white expanse. Elias watched until he disappeared, swallowed by light. For a long time after, the cabin felt different. Not emptier, just changed. Like a pond rippled by a single stone, then still again. He sat down, reopened the ledger, and wrote. A visitor reminds the still water that it can move, and still remain itself. Then he closed the book and listened. The wolves howled again, distant but sure. The quiet returned, deeper than before. Time, Elias realized, didn't move in a straight line. It drifted, like wind through pine branches, circling, returning, never truly leaving. The years passed not with fanfare, but with whispers. Snow fell and melted. Wolves came and went. The cabin aged gently, its logs darkening like the lines on his hands. Elias had stopped measuring days long ago. He marked time instead by the small certainties. When the first raven called. When the ice cracked open on the lake. When the wolves' howls softened from hunger to harmony. He no longer feared the storms that swept through the valley. They came suddenly, walls of wind and snow so dense the world vanished for hours, sometimes days. But Elias would sit by the fire, unmoving, listening to the storm rage against the walls, as if testing his resolve. He didn't fight it. He waited. Every storm, he learned, ends the same way, in silence. Have you ever noticed how most of life's tempests sound terrifying only until you stop resisting them? When the skies cleared, the land gleamed with newness, trees rinsed clean, rivers shining with thawed light. He'd step outside barefoot, feeling the sting of cold earth beneath him. Age had slowed him, but it hadn't dulled his sense of wonder. Each wrinkle, each ache, each breath, It all belonged here. He was as much a part of this place as the moss that crept up his cabin walls or the frost that painted his windows. Sometimes he wondered how many winters he'd seen. 10, 20, a lifetime. It didn't matter. Time here wasn't something you survived. It was something you joined. Do you think aging is loss or transformation? He'd sit outside for hours, wrapped in furs, watching light slide across the snow. The wolves still visited, though less often now. The black alpha was gone, replaced by another, younger one. Elias smiled at the change. The world had continued as it always would. He remembered the words of his old friend Jonah, long dead now. The wild doesn't need us, but it welcomes us if we learn to listen. He thought of that often. Maybe that was all any of us ever needed, to listen and to belong without owning. On quiet evenings, the sky would bloom with Aurora. Colors rippled across the darkness, green, violet, gold, like the breath of something ancient and alive. He'd watch until his eyes watered, until the cold bit too deep. He wondered if the wolves saw the same lights and whether they too felt small beneath them, or free. Have you ever realized that freedom and surrender might be the same thing, seen from opposite sides of acceptance? His reflection in the lake changed. The beard white now, eyes softer, clearer. He no longer saw the man who came to Alaska chasing silence. He saw someone shaped by it, sculpted by cold and solitude into something simpler, truer. He wrote in the ledger less and less. The words had begun to feel unnecessary, like explaining sunlight to the sun. Sometimes he'd open to a blank page, look at it for a long while, then close it again. The silence said more. When he did write, his words were spare. Storm passed. Wolves sang. Fire howled. That was all. That was enough. One morning, a storm rolled through, the fiercest he'd ever seen. The wind howled like a living thing, and the walls groaned under the weight of snow. But Elias didn't move from his chair. He simply watched the flames dance, steady and small, against the roar. He whispered, "We've done this before." And the storm, as if it had heard, began to ease. When morning came, the world was pure again, white, soft, silent. Elias stepped outside. The air bit deep, but he smiled anyway. The snow glittered under sunlight, perfect in its impermanence. He thought of all the years that had passed through him like wind through the trees. He felt them still, each one alive in his breath, his bones, his silence. Do you think time ever truly leaves us, or does it just learn to rest inside our hearts? He turned toward the cabin, smoke rising gently from the chimney, and whispered, "I'm still here." And the wilderness, in its quiet way, whispered back. Fire had always been his truest companion. In the beginning, it was survival, a fragile flame trembling in the endless dark, the difference between breath and stillness. Now, years later, it had become something else, a memory that still breathed beside him. Each night, Elias fed it with slow care. Pine first, then birch, then a few splinters of spruce to keep it steady. The same rhythm he'd practiced for decades, like an old prayer whispered without words. He'd sit close to it, feeling its warmth crawl up through his bones, chasing away the chill that age had begun to nest deep inside him. The firelight painted his face in shades of gold and shadow, and sometimes in the shifting glow, he almost saw his younger self again, the man who had stumbled into this wilderness full of noise and fear. Have you ever looked into something ancient and seen your own reflection moving inside it? The fire was a storyteller. Every crack, every hiss was a voice. Sometimes it spoke of storms, sometimes of silence. Sometimes it said nothing at all, and even that was a kind of truth. Elias remembered the first fire he ever built here. How his hands shook, how the wind nearly stole the spark each time. He remembered Jonah's lessons. Fire's like trust. It doesn't belong to you. You tend it or it dies. And he had tended it, through snow and hunger, through fear and sleep. It had never left him. It had never betrayed him. He smiled faintly. Perhaps that's what companionship truly was, something that stayed when everything else went quiet. Do you think we ever truly tame what we depend on, or do we simply learn how to live with its power? The wolves no longer came near the cabin now. Their howls had moved farther into the mountains where the younger packs roamed. But on some nights, when the air was still, Elias would hear echoes, faint, thin as memory, and feel at peace. They had not abandoned him. They had simply moved on, as all living things must. He thought of the pups he'd once seen tumbling in snow. They were likely gone now, their children running through the same white valleys. The pattern continued. It always did. He reached for his ledger, its pages yellowed, the ink faded but legible. He turned to the first entry, fire caught, wolves near, snow falling, still alive. He chuckled softly, the sound like gravel warmed by the sun. So much had changed, and yet nothing truly had. The same snow, the same wind, the same quiet. Only the man sitting beside the fire had been shaped differently by it. Have you ever realized that you're still the same person you once were, only quieter, more in rhythm with the things that stay? The flames flickered lower, curling around the last piece of wood. He leaned forward and whispered to it, "You and I, we've kept each other alive." The fire answered with a single soft crack like laughter. He closed his eyes and let its warmth press against his skin. Behind his eyelids, he saw not the cabin but the years, the storms, the wolves, the silence. They weren't memories. They were still here, folded into the air, breathing through the same space as he did. He opened his eyes again and added one final line to the ledger. Even fire must sleep. Then he let it burn low, content with its dim glow. The light flickered across the cabin walls, painting slow shadows that looked like ghosts of trees swaying in a wind that no longer existed. Have you ever watched something fade and realized it isn't ending, it's transforming? When the last ember finally winked out, the darkness wasn't frightening. It was soft, almost kind. Elias sat there in the silence, feeling the warmth still lingering on his palms, a ghost of all the winters he had survived. And in that warmth, fading but real, he understood. The fire had never truly belonged to him. It had simply shared its light for a while, as everything in this world does. He smiled into the dark and whispered, "Thank you." Outside, the wind shifted, and far away, a single wolf howled. Sleep came differently now. Not as escape, but as a slow descent, like snow falling through still air. Elias no longer dreamed in pictures. He dreamed in sensations. Warmth, wind, the taste of pine smoke, the hush of snowfall. Sometimes the dreams felt so real that waking became the illusion. Sometimes he wasn't sure which world he belonged to anymore. One night, as frost painted the windows and the wolves sang far away, Elias dreamed of the valley, not as it was now, but as it had been long ago, untouched by his footprints. The snow shimmered blue beneath the moon, and the air glowed faintly as if alive. He walked without effort, his body light. The cold didn't bite. The ground didn't resist. Everything seemed to breathe with him. And then he saw them, the wolves, not the same pack but their echoes. Dozens of shapes moving like mist across the valley floor, their eyes bright as starlight. They didn't look at him with fear or recognition. They simply ran, graceful and unhurried, weaving through the trees as if tracing the pulse of the earth itself. He felt something rise inside him, a quiet joy, a wordless belonging. This was not a dream of memory. It was a dream of return. Have you ever dreamed of a place so vividly that you woke certain you had left part of yourself behind? The valley stretched endlessly, silver and silent. Elias walked beside the wolves, though his feet left no prints. The black alpha from years past appeared ahead, older, slower, yet still dignified. It turned to him once, eyes catching the moonlight. In that gaze he saw everything: youth, hunger, solitude, peace. Then it turned back and continued walking, and Elias followed. They climbed a ridge together, the air thinning, stars crowding closer. From the summit, he could see everything he had ever known. The lake, the cabin, the forests, all bathed in faint aurora light. It looked smaller now, but somehow more complete. He realized then that the dream wasn't about leaving. It was about seeing the whole circle at once. Do you think understanding comes when we reach the end, or when we finally see where it all began? The wolves stopped at the crest. The alpha looked back one last time. Its breath formed a cloud that shimmered like firelight, then vanished. Elias reached out a hand. The air between them pulsed warm for an instant, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. And then silence. The valley dissolved into snowlight. The wolves disappeared. Elias stood alone but not lonely. He could still feel them moving somewhere nearby, not in body but in rhythm. He realized they had never left. They were part of the same current he now floated in, the quiet current that carried everything living toward the same horizon. He woke with tears on his face, though his heart felt light. The fire had burned low. Dawn was just a whisper on the edge of the window. He sat up slowly, joints stiff but steady, and whispered, "I saw them." He didn't need to write it down. The dream had written itself into him. Have you ever woken from a dream that felt more real than waking? One that didn't fade when the light returned? For the rest of the morning, he moved quietly as if afraid to disturb what lingered. Every sound, the crackle of the fire, the drip of melting frost, the soft groan of wood, felt connected to what he had seen. He knew the line between dreaming and living had thinned, perhaps for good. He stepped outside. The sky was clear, wide, blue beyond belief. No wind, no sound, only stillness. The valley stretched before him exactly as it had in his dream, and for the first time he felt no difference between the two. The first snow of the season came early that year. Not a storm, not a blizzard, just a quiet, steady fall. It drifted down like ash from some invisible fire, layering the earth with silence. Elias stood in the doorway of his cabin, watching it gather. Each flake seemed to move with purpose, unhurried, certain of where it belonged. He thought, if only people could fall like snow, without resistance, without fear. The air smelled of wood smoke and pine. Inside, the fire burned low, steady as a heartbeat. His wolf dogs were gone now, long buried under winter's past. The world had become still, pared down to essentials: breath, warmth, memory. He no longer needed much. A few logs, a pot of water, the company of the wind. Time had stopped measuring itself in years and started measuring itself in quiet moments between breaths. Have you ever felt time slow down so much that it becomes something you can almost touch? He walked to the edge of the clearing, his boots sinking softly into the powder. Each step was a whisper. The valley stretched around him, endless white under a pale sky. Somewhere far off, a single raven cried, a thin black line against all that purity. He smiled. Still here, old friend. Elias's body had grown frail, but his mind was clearer than ever. He saw things as they were, without judgment, without needing them to last. The trees bent with snow, and he thought they looked more beautiful bowed than proud. He'd stopped tending the fire at night. It would die out slowly as he slept, and he didn't mind the cold anymore. The cold, he thought, was honest. It didn't take. It simply reminded you that you were alive. He dreamed often now, though he could no longer tell where dreaming began. The wolves came to him, sometimes near, sometimes distant. Once, in a dream, he saw the black alpha again. It didn't look old or young. It simply looked eternal. They stood facing each other in falling snow, neither predator nor prey. Then the wolf turned and began to walk away, leaving a trail of prints that glowed faintly in the dark. Elias followed until the tracks vanished into light. When he woke, dawn was creeping across the sky. The snow had stopped. The world was white, perfect, silent. He moved slowly that day as if wading through another dream. Built a small fire, warmed his hands, wrote one final note in the ledger. Snow soft. Quiet morning. All well. He closed the book and set it beside him. The firelight danced across his face, gentle, golden. He whispered to the flame, "You can rest now." Have you ever noticed how endings, when they're true, don't feel like endings at all? That night, the wind rose again, but softly, like someone whispering his name from far away. Elias lay in his bed, the furs pulled high, the smell of wood smoke clinging to everything. He could hear the faint rhythm of snow hitting the roof, steady, eternal. His breathing slowed. The warmth of the fire faded, replaced by something deeper, wider. It wasn't sleep exactly, but something close, something gentler. He thought of the valley, of the wolves, of the way the Aurora once shimmered green across the night sky. He thought of how small and beautiful life really was, how fragile and fierce all at once. He whispered into the darkness, "I'm not leaving, just becoming part of it." Outside, the snow fell softly, covering the old tracks, the worn path, the roof of the cabin. The fire burned down to embers, glowing like tiny suns, then dimmed. By morning, the world was quiet. The cabin stood under a blanket of white. No footprints, no smoke, no sound, only stillness. And in that stillness, the wolves howled once more. Not mournful, not wild, just alive. The men from Fairbanks found the cabin in early spring. They weren't looking for it. A survey plane had spotted the roof from above, a faint square beneath the snow, half buried, half remembered by the land. So they came on snowshoes, following a trail that no map had ever drawn. The first thing they noticed was the silence. Not the ordinary kind, but the deep kind, thick and waiting. Even their voices seemed smaller here. They opened the door carefully, as if afraid to wake something. Inside, everything was in its place. The chair by the fire, the ledger on the table, a cup half filled with melted snow. The fire had long gone cold, but there was no sense of loss, only completion. One of the men, a young ranger named David, found the ledger. He brushed the frost from its cover and opened it. The last line read, "Snow soft. Quiet morning. All well." He read it twice. Have you ever read words so calm they made you question what ending really means? They searched the clearing, not expecting much. Elias's tracks were faint but visible, leading down toward the frozen lake, then disappearing where wind had swept the snow clean. At the lake's edge, they found something small, the outline of a hand pressed into the snow as if someone had paused there to say goodbye. David stood for a long time looking at it. He felt no sadness, only awe. "Man lived here," another ranger said quietly. "Lived," David repeated, "and became part of it." They stayed a while reading through the old notes. Pages of simple observations. Wolves passing, storms breaking, fires holding. There were no grand thoughts, no declarations. Just a life recorded honestly. The wolves had returned too. Their tracks circled the cabin, fresh, sharp, weaving through the trees. They hadn't disturbed anything. It was as if they knew. Do you think the wild remembers those who truly belong to it? As the men packed up, David tore a small page from his notebook and placed it beside the ledger. He wrote only 3 words, "Found him home." Then he closed the book and set it back on the table, where sunlight from the window touched it like a blessing. Before they left, he stepped outside one last time and looked toward the horizon. The valley stretched endlessly, silver and calm. Somewhere in the distance, he heard a faint howl, long, low, steady. He couldn't tell if it was real or memory. Either way, it felt right. He turned back toward the cabin and whispered, "Rest easy, old man. Have you ever felt that some lives don't end, they just change form, becoming wind, snow, story?" As they disappeared into the trees, the wilderness closed behind them. Snow drifted back over their footprints. The light shifted. By dusk, the clearing looked untouched again, as if no one had ever been there at all. But something had changed. The silence had a new shape to it, a new weight. And when the first wolf appeared at the tree line that night, it didn't approach the cabin. It simply sat, lifted its head, and howled once, a low, echoing sound that rolled through the valley like a prayer. Then it turned and vanished into the dark. The snow kept falling, soft as breath. The cabin stood still, wrapped in white. And inside, on the wooden table, the ledger remained, open to the last page. The words waited, gentle and eternal. "Snow soft. Quiet morning. All well." Years passed, and the valley forgot the names of men. Cabins rotted. Footprints faded. But some stories refused to vanish. They lingered in the way light touched the snow, in the sound of wind sliding through spruce branches, in the faint echo of a howl carried across frozen air. The story of Elias Rowe was one of them. Trappers spoke of him in low voices when storms pressed against the walls. Guides told his tale to tourists, their faces glowing in the reflection of campfire flames. They called him the listener or the man who walked with wolves. No one agreed on the details. Some said he'd vanished into the snow one morning, leaving no trace. Others claimed a pack of wolves had been seen circling his cabin for 3 days, guarding it, before disappearing into the tundra. A few swore they'd heard his voice carried by the wind, whispering through the pines. But every version ended the same way. He didn't die. He simply became part of the wilderness. Have you ever heard a story that feels less like fiction and more like something your soul already knew? There was a young boy once, son of a bush pilot, who found the cabin decades later. He said the air there felt different, thicker somehow, full of listening. When he spoke, the sound didn't echo. It sank into the world as if the land itself were still paying attention. He opened the old ledger. The ink had faded, but one line remained clear. All well. He read it aloud, and the air around him seemed to still, like a breath being held. Later, when he flew home, he told his father he thought he saw something moving on the ridge. A man, or maybe just a shadow walking beside wolves. The father smiled and said, "You saw the valley remembering. Do you think the earth can remember those who walked it gently enough?" In time, the cabin fell completely. Moss claimed the walls. Birch roots split the floorboards. But the place didn't feel abandoned. If you stood there long enough in silence, you could still hear small sounds, the pop of a long cold fire, the whisper of turning pages, the low murmur of a man thinking aloud. Hikers who passed through sometimes said the wolves acted strangely near that spot. They'd pause, lift their heads, then sit quietly as if waiting for something unseen. Then they'd move on, calm, unafraid. Rangers stopped marking the site on maps. They said it was better that way, that some places needed to belong to mystery. And so, Elias's story became what all true stories become. Not history but atmosphere. Something breathed, not spoken. Have you ever stood in a place so silent you felt it watching you back? People still talk about him in small towns across the interior. An old trapper in Nenana keeps a faded photograph said to be Elias in his youth, though no one knows who took it. A teacher in Anchorage reads his story to her students each winter, reminding them that the wild isn't something to conquer but something to understand. And a biologist at Denali still quotes him to her students. Know what you're killing. Respect it. Make the death mean something. The wolves still run through those valleys. Their territories haven't changed much since his maps. When they howl at night, the sound rolls down through the mountains, past rivers, through forests that remember. Some nights, when the Aurora dances across the sky, the light bends in a strange way, almost forming the outline of a man sitting beside a fire, head bowed, listening. Those who've seen it never argue about what it was. They just fall silent the way you do when something sacred passes through you. And the valley, always patient, always watching, keeps the story. Because some lives don't end, they echo. Through snow, through silence, through the hearts of those who still believe in the wisdom of the wild. Have you ever wondered what will echo of you when the world grows quiet again? The wind moves through the spruce trees. The snow shifts. Somewhere, a wolf howls and the sound seems to carry a name. Not spoken but remembered. Elias Rowe. The man who listened. The man who stayed. The classroom was small, its windows fogged with the warmth of breath and snow pressed against the glass. Beyond, the Alaskan sky hung low and pale, heavy with winter. Inside, a dozen students sat in quiet attention as Professor Marin Chin wrote a name on the board. Elias Rowe, the listener. She turned to face them, her voice soft but steady. Before there were studies or grants or drones or data streams, there was this man. She let the silence fill the room. He lived alone in the wilderness for more than 30 years. He studied wolves without instruments, without technology, just by being there. A hand rose. Professor, was he a scientist? She smiled faintly. No, but maybe he was something better. The students waited. Outside, wind brushed against the window like a passing thought. He didn't measure the wolves with numbers, she continued. He measured them with time, with patience. He listened. She played a short recording, a distant howl carried across static. The rose fell then faded. The sound hung in the air long after it ended. Have you ever listened to something so deeply that it changed the way you breathe? The first lesson of wilderness ecology, she said, isn't observation. It's humility. To watch without wanting. To hear without needing to speak. To let silence teach you. On the desk in front of her sat a weathered object. A small leather-bound notebook sealed in glass. The label read, Elias Rowe's Field Journal, 1929 to 1957. The students leaned closer as if approaching something sacred. The professor's voice softened. He didn't write theories, just fragments. She recited a few lines from memory. Wolves moved east today. Ice breaking. Fire holding. All well. One student whispered, it sounds like poetry. Marin nodded. In a way it is. The poetry of reality, clear, unadorned, and alive. She paused, letting the quiet return. Then she asked, when was the last time you went outside and listened, really listened, to the wind, the trees, the snow? No one answered. You live in a world that speaks constantly, she said. But most of it isn't saying anything. Elias understood that silence is not emptiness. It's presence. Have you ever thought that silence might be the language of things that last? She walked to the window. Outside, the snow was falling again, slow, deliberate. Elias believed that understanding nature wasn't about control or data, she continued. It was about relationship. You don't take from it, you enter into it. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. Do you think he was lonely? Marin smiled sadly. No. He was alone but not lonely. There's a difference. She tapped the notebook's glass case gently. He once wrote, I keep company with fire, wind, and wolves. What more could a man ask? The class fell silent. Outside, a snowplow passed distantly, its hum fading into the white world beyond. Marin closed her notebook. The point isn't to live like him, she said quietly. The point is to remember that kind of seeing, that kind of listening, is still possible. She looked around the room, her eyes kind but serious. When you go out into the field next week, I don't want you to take measurements. I want you to sit for 1 hour and do nothing. No notes, no phones, no talking. Just be. The way Elias was. She smiled. If you're lucky, you might hear the wolves. A few students laughed softly, but none dismissed it. Something in her tone told them it wasn't a metaphor. The bell rang. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. The students filed out into the falling snow, their breath rising like ghosts. Marin stayed a moment longer, standing beside the old notebook. She whispered, almost to herself, "You taught better than any of us ever could." And in the hush that followed, the wind outside seemed to shift. A faint sound, low and distant, like the echo of a howl rolling through time. The student's name was Kai. He had sat in the front row of Professor Marin's class, quiet, thoughtful. His notebook nearly empty except for a single line he had written during her lecture. To listen without wanting. That sentence followed him for weeks. He'd catch himself thinking of it in the cafeteria line, on the bus, while scrolling through his phone. The noise of life felt sharper now, too loud, too constant. So one evening, without telling anyone, he packed a small bag, some food, a sleeping bag, and a worn copy of Elias Rowe's field notes, and headed north. He followed the old maps, the ones Marin had shown in class. The roads turned to dirt, the dirt to snow, the snow to silence. By the third day, there were no more tire tracks, no more signs of people. Only the hush of the wilderness, deep and steady as breath. He found the lake by instinct. It was half frozen, the surface smooth and black like glass. Across it, faint hills curved beneath the weight of stars. He didn't see the cabin, it was long gone, but he felt something in the air, a density, as if the place itself were remembering. Have you ever walked into a silence so complete you could hear your heartbeat as part of the landscape? Kai set up camp on the edge of the lake. The cold bit hard, but it was honest, clean. He boiled snow for tea, wrapped himself in a blanket, and watched the light fade. As darkness deepened, the sky began to shift. First a faint shimmer, then a pulse. Then the aurora rose, green, then violet, then gold, rippling across the heavens like a river of light. It moved in silence, yet it felt like song. Kai stood, his breath misting before him. The light reflected in the ice at his feet, dancing around him like ghosts. He thought of Elias sitting somewhere near this same lake decades ago, watching the same sky. He whispered into the cold, "Are you still here?" The wind stirred. Somewhere far away, a wolf howled, soft, distant, familiar. The sound moved through the valley, through him, through everything. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he didn't feel like himself anymore. He felt like part of something vast, something alive. Do you think the dead are ever truly gone? Or do they simply change the way they exist in the world? When he opened his eyes again, the aurora was brighter. The lights curved downward, bending low, brushing the surface of the lake. And for a heartbeat, just one, he thought he saw a man standing there. Not solid, not ghostly, just presence. A figure in fur and shadow, calm, patient, listening. The same stillness he'd heard about in Marin's voice. The same silence Elias had carried all his life. Kai didn't move. He only whispered, "I understand." The figure seemed to nod, then dissolved into light. The aurora rippled once more and rose back into the stars. He stood there long after the colors faded. The lake froze harder under his boots. The sky returned to its cold brilliance. And yet the quiet that followed wasn't emptiness. It was full, alive with echoes. He finally sat down, pulled the field journal from his pack, and opened it. On the inside cover, where he'd written nothing before, he now wrote, "Saw the light, heard the wolves, still listening." He closed the book gently, as if afraid to wake something ancient within it. Have you ever realized that wonder and understanding might be the same thing, just felt at different depths? When morning came, the valley glowed faint blue beneath new snow. Kai packed his things but didn't rush to leave. He stood one last time at the edge of the frozen lake, feeling the air move across his skin, feeling himself small and whole all at once. Then he whispered into the wind, "Thank you." And far away, faint but clear, the wolves answered. When Kai returned to the city, everything felt louder. Engines, advertisements, voices, all clashing, all desperate to be heard. After weeks of silence, the noise hit him like weather. He didn't resent it, he simply saw it for what it was. The sound of a world that had forgotten how to listen. He moved slower now. Stopped wearing headphones. Stopped checking his phone each time it buzzed. Friends asked if something was wrong. He said no, but they didn't quite believe him. How do you explain that stillness can be more fulfilling than applause? He began walking each evening through the parks at the city's edge. Sometimes he'd stop and just listen, to the rustle of leaves, the hum of traffic blending with wind, the distant bark of a dog. It wasn't wilderness, but it was still alive. Every sound, every silence, carried meaning if you were patient enough to hear it. Soon people started joining him. At first 1 or 2, then dozens. Students, office workers, strangers who said they couldn't sleep anymore. They'd walk together for an hour, saying little, learning to let quiet settle. He called it the listening path. No rules, no goal. Just a slow walk through ordinary places, noticing the world instead of rushing through it. Have you ever realized that when you stop talking, the world starts speaking back? He shared the story of Elias sometimes, softly by lamplight, the way Marin had told it to him. He spoke of the man who lived with wolves, who found peace not by escaping the world but by belonging to it completely. He told them about the fire that burned steady through the storms, about the final words in the ledger, all well. People listened, and in that listening, something in them changed. A woman said she'd started waking up early just to hear the city before it came alive. A boy said he'd gone camping for the first time and stayed up all night, not afraid of the dark but curious about it. An old man wept quietly and said he'd forgotten what silence felt like. Kai never claimed to teach. He only reminded. Silence, he told them, is not empty. It's full of answers you can't hear when you're shouting. He began to notice things others missed. The rhythm of footsteps on wet pavement, the subtle tone in a stranger's laugh, the way light shifted at sunset like breath exhaling. Each detail was a reminder that the world was speaking constantly, if only you slowed enough to understand. Do you think peace comes from having less noise, or from learning how to listen within it? The walks grew longer. They began holding night gatherings under open skies. No music, no speeches, just people sitting quietly, watching the stars, sharing warmth and silence. Someone once asked him if he was religious. He smiled and said, no, just attentive. One winter evening, as snow began to fall, Kai felt something stir, a memory, a voice not his own. He thought of Elias standing by the lake, the Aurora rippling above him. The image came so clearly it was almost a visitation. He whispered, I'm still listening. And the wind, curling through the bare branches, seemed to answer, good. The world around him was the same as it had always been, but his way of seeing it had changed forever. He understood now that listening wasn't about sound. It was about presence, about being with life exactly as it is, unfiltered, unhurried, unafraid. And in that awareness, even the smallest noise became a hymn. A bus sighing at a stoplight, a pigeon fluttering off a railing, a drop of melting snow hitting his sleeve. He smiled softly. The world had always been singing. He'd just been too distracted to notice. Have you ever realized that maybe peace isn't something you find, but something that's been waiting for you to hear it? That night, as he walked home, snow gathering on his coat, he thought of Elias one last time. Not as a myth, not as a ghost, but as a teacher who never spoke aloud. A man who showed that listening was another word for love. And beneath the quiet hum of the sleeping city, Kai could almost hear wolves far away, their voices rising through time. Not calling him, but reminding him. All well. Years folded quietly into one another, like pages of a well-read book. The walks continued, though slower now. Kai's hair turned silver, his voice softened with age. He no longer led the listening path so much as walked among it, a gentle presence, quiet but constant, like the hum beneath a song. The city around him grew taller, brighter, faster. People lived in noise again, but some still remembered. Each winter, a few returned to walk with him, students, travelers, children of those who once followed the path. They said the silence felt different when he was near, as if the air itself calmed to match his heartbeat. He smiled when they said that. It isn't me, he would whisper. It's the world waiting for you to notice. Have you ever realized how every generation rediscovers the same truth, only in new languages? When the first snow fell each year, he would walk to the edge of the old park where the city met the forest. There he'd stand still, eyes closed, letting the sound of falling snow fill him. It was never silent, Snow has its own music, soft and endless. He'd whisper the same words every time, still listening. Sometimes he thought of Elias, not as a legend anymore but as kin. Two men separated by time, bound by quiet. He wondered if Elias had known his story would ripple outward, carried by voices he'd never meet. Probably not. He hadn't lived for remembrance. He'd lived for belonging. Do you think the truest legacies are the ones never meant to be legacies at all? Kai's body grew frail, but his eyes stayed clear, the same stillness burning inside them. He no longer needed to travel far. The world came to him. Children would sit by his feet, asking what the wolves sounded like, and he'd laugh softly. Like truth, he'd say. Lonely, beautiful truth. When asked what silence meant to him, he always paused before answering. Silence, he'd say finally, isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of everything. One evening, near the end of his life, Kai returned to the mountains. He wanted to see the Aurora one last time. The journey took days. He moved slowly like someone walking through memory. When he reached the frozen lake, the sky greeted him the way it had greeted Elias, a vast cathedral of light. Green, gold, violet, flowing like breath across the stars. He sat by the ice, wrapped in a blanket, and waited. The wolves came later, silent shapes moving between the trees. One approached, old and gray. It stopped a few yards away and watched him. Kai didn't move. He only smiled. Still listening, he whispered. The wolf tilted its head, then lifted its muzzle to the sky. Its howl rolled through the valley, long and steady. Other voices joined, one then many, until the air trembled with their song. Kai closed his eyes. He felt the sound pass through him, deep and low, like the heartbeat of the earth. And in that moment, he wasn't man or teacher or traveler. He was simply part of the chorus. Have you ever felt the world singing through you instead of to you? When morning came, the wolves were gone. The aurora had faded. Only snow remained, soft, endless, beautiful. A ranger found him days later, seated peacefully by the lake, eyes half open, a faint smile frozen on his lips. Beside him lay his small notebook. The final page read, "Heard them again. Sky bright. All well." They buried him near the tree line where the forest met the open air. No monument, no plaque. Just the whisper of wind through branches, the cry of ravens circling overhead. Years later, hikers still spoke of the place. They said the air there was different, quiet but alive, like a held breath before music begins. And sometimes, if you stood long enough in the falling snow, you could hear it. Not words, not howls, just the low rhythm of something ancient and kind, moving through the silence. The sound that remains.